Hey everyone, this is Dean DeFino from the English department. I'm happy to be with you again. Today I wanted to talk about the ways in which gender and sexuality can essentially change the way we see things. Different perspectives can influence the way we understand things. And by way of doing that, I wanted to use the example of a 2019 film called Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which some of you may be familiar with. Film directed by Céline Sciamma, who is at the center of that picture, along with the two stars of the film. They're at the Cannes Film Festival, where the film won the Queer Palme d'Or that year. And I wanted to talk about it first and foremost as a story of women. In fact, three different stories of women. There's a story of one woman who's been betrothed to a Milanese gentleman, essentially to save the family's fortunes, her mom is marrying her off. There's the story of two women, which is a romance that develops between the betrothed woman and another woman who was hired by her mom to essentially paint a glamour portrait of her to send off to her prospective husband. And then there is a story of three women, the sorority of three women. So we have the two lovers, and then we have the housemaid whom they befriend in the absence of the mother. The mother goes away, and they sort of establish this kind of democratic order within the household and eventually help each other in a pretty big way, which we'll talk about shortly. So in order to understand this story, we need to have some sense of the context for it. In fact, multiple contexts. Now I want to start with time and place. So this is a story that takes place in the 1700s, that is to say the 18th century, in Brittany, which is the sort of northwestern coast of France. You can see it highlighted there on the map that I'm showing you. And it actually occurs on a small isolated island in Brittany. An unnamed island in this particular case, very sparsely populated. The other context for this is that it's a story of queer women in a patriarchy, which is to say a male-dominated society where the values and perspectives and success and power of men is placed above women. And there are a couple of ways of thinking about the patriarchy here and the way it impacts queer women. One is objectification, to make an object or to make property of a woman, to think of one's betrothed, for example, as one's property. And the portrait that's being painted of Eloise, the character who's being married off in this film, you can see the finished portrait here, is in a sense an emblem of that objectification, that the man refuses to marry the woman until he sees what she looks like, right? And once having done that, then presumably she will head off to Milan, and the dowry will be dealt with, and so on and so forth. Marriage in the West, but also in the East in many different cultures, meant that the man actually held the woman in property, that his wife belonged to him. And this is going to be particularly germane to something that we're talking about a little further down the line. So when we talk about someone being an object of desire, that's what we mean. The objectification of them, turning them into an object. The second way of thinking about women, and not just in 18th century Brittany, but broadly speaking historically, when we're thinking about queerness in women, is in terms of invisibility. And I'm going to draw a couple of times from quotes from an interview with the director of the film, Céline Sciamma, because I think she actually expresses better than I can what the intent of the film is. So she talks here about lesbian life. She herself identifies as queer. She says, the tragedy of lesbian life is not the tragedy of lesbian representation. In other words, not the way that lesbians have historically been seen. The tragedy is that we get erased from history. Because pardon me, that should say our, not out, because our stories are dangerous for patriarchy. The male gaze is obsessed with representing lesbians in a certain way to control us. Our stories are powerful because they are dangerous. We are dangerous. And I want to sort of punch up what she means by dangerous here. In a patriarchy, a lesbian woman, that is to say, someone who is in a position to sort of opt out of the social order, who isn't necessarily bound by conventions of marriage and child rearing and so on and so forth, is essentially not abiding by the rules or by the power structure of the patriarchy. So a lesbian woman might be seen as a threat. And how does one undo a threat? In two possible ways. One is to appropriate their story, and in the story representations of queer women, that's often in terms of hypersexual portrayals of them. And the other is to make them invisible, to simply eliminate or remove their stories so that there's nothing to compete with the central patriarchal narrative. There's nothing to compete with the idea that men are in a position of power and women are always subservient to that power. Which brings us to the concept of the gaze, which is a term that I've certainly often bring up in class, and it's something that I think is often also misunderstood. So I want to spend a little bit of time defining it. Essentially, when we talk about the gaze, we mean the power of looking. That is to say, the power of looking at something or someone else as an object. There's an act of possession in it, right? And we see this in Western art all over the place. Here's a 16th century painting by the Italian painter Titian of a supine naked woman who's holding a bunch of grapes, and she has her hands over her genitals. It's a domestic scene, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things to sort of suggest the idea, this is, by the way, an image of Venus, to suggest the idea that she is physically and sexually desirable, but also that she is subservient, which is one of the reasons why she's lying down. She's not standing, she's not empowered. But these images aren't just 16th century Italian, they run throughout the history of Western art and popular culture. Here's an advertisement for Burberry's Body from last year, which essentially uses exactly the same idea. The objectification of a supine woman as an object of desire, of sexual desire specifically, as a means of control, subjugation into the patriarchy. So very often when we talk about the gaze, we talk about the male gaze, the power of the man looking, taking possession of the woman as an object for purposes of domination or sexual gratification. In the movie where Eloise is supposed to be painted, Marianne, the artist, actually comes in originally sort of under false pretenses. She's arrived to be her companion. Eloise's older sister had recently committed suicide due to a betrothal to the same man and her decision that she couldn't possibly be married. She jumps off a cliff and kills herself. So the mother, at least in part, hires the artist to keep a watch over Eloise to make sure that she doesn't do the same thing. But in order to paint a portrait of Eloise, who doesn't know that she's there for that purpose, or otherwise would not agree to sit for the portrait, she has to get sort of furtive looks at her. She has to take glances of her whenever she can. So she has these walks organized every day where they're together for several hours. And every chance she gets, Marianne looks over at Eloise and tries to capture the impression of her face. So she's exercising the gaze of the artist in this case, the desire to possess or control or take power over, or at least to understand or see the image of the subject that she's supposed to be painting. There's another way of thinking about the gaze, or the direction of the gaze in any case, which is to see or to be seen or to see someone, right? Which, rather than taking the position of seeing something else as an object, now we're thinking more about the subject. Now we're looking at, but how we are looking, right? The ways in which looking allows us to understand what we're looking at better, closer in proximity to the subject. So in the movie, the two women eventually fall in love. Eloise discovers that Marianne is painting a portrait of her. She's very unsatisfied with the original portrait because it doesn't look like her, right? Because Marianne hasn't been seeing her, she's only been looking at her. And so she agrees to sit for the second portrait. And in the process of her sitting, little by little begins to reveal more of herself, and Marianne begins to know her better. Now, this brings me to a really key moment in this movie, and I want to give you a little bit of forewarning on it. It's one of the more challenging, maybe the most challenging scene in the entire film, which is a scene of an abortion. Now, it's not an abortion in great detail, or graphic detail, I should say, but we do see the entire procedure from something of a distance, and framed in a particular way. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about, to sort of set up this scene before I ask your instructors to watch it with you, how abortion is typically handled as a film subject. And there are three particular ways if you sort of look at the history of it. The first is as a kind of cautionary tale about sin, where the woman who is seeking an abortion is either punished, very often she will die as a result of it, or she's driven to another choice, which is to say to have the child in most cases, or there's an accidental miscarriage or something happens to allow her to avoid choosing abortion. The second is, and by the way, in almost all of these cases, these representations are made by male directors and male screenwriters. The second is through clinical representation as a kind of medical procedure, which is largely devoid of any particular emotional component. So you're just sort of watching the procedure happen as though you're sitting in an operating room. And then the third way in which abortion typically figures, and often, by the way, these will overlap, is a kind of ideological declaration where the woman is an object lesson, or she's supporting evidence for a particular position that the film has on the subject of abortion. Now, before you start watching this scene, I wanted to raise three questions for you to consider as you're going through it. And then maybe to spend a few minutes with your instructor to kind of, talk through some potential answers to these questions. The first question is, what details stand out? What is it about this scene that sort of jumps out at you? The second is, what sort of feelings or emotions come up while you're watching this scene? It's certainly fraught. It's a fraught subject, but the scene itself is filled with emotion as well. And the third is, what message, if any, do you think that this scene presents? What are we supposed to take away from it? What does it say? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to watch the scene. It runs about 2.5 minutes long, something like that. And then we'll come back and discuss it. Okay, so I want to focus on three particular details, and I'm sure that you'll have others to add, and hopefully some came up in your conversation. Maybe after this discussion, you can spend a little time kind of elaborating on them. One is the injunction by Eloise to Marianne. Marianne's the painter here, and Eloise is the subject. She's the one being painted. Eloise says to Marianne, the painter, look, right? Look at what's going on here. Don't avert your eyes. It's clear that Marianne's very uncomfortable with what she's seeing. So she's looking at the floor, she's turning away. And Eloise says, no, look, bear witness to this, right? The second detail I would draw your attention to is the high angle, which we get for most of the scene, where we're looking down from a 90-degree angle down on the subject. This is Sophie, the housemaid, who's the one having the abortion in this particular scene. She's been impregnated by the only man who appears in this movie, and he shows up for a few moments at the beginning of the film and a few moments afterward. But it is his child, we're led to believe. So the high angle of this shot, that we're looking straight down at her as though the camera is on the ceiling. And then the third is the position of the children on the bed in proximity to Sophie. One of them we see in this particular shot, the baby is actually grabbing her nose, and Sophie is beginning to weep. Maybe as a result of this, maybe as some, the pain that she's suffering, probably as a combination of those things. And the reason I call out these three particular details is because I find them to be fairly ambiguous, right? We've been talking about seeing, as seeing someone for who they are, as seeing someone in the full dimension of the reality. But the command here from Eloise is to look, to simply bear witness, to take it in, right? To take possession of what is in front of you. And I'll explain to you why that's so important in a second when we get to a scene that directly follows this one. The high angle was striking to me because this is often the angle that we see in clinical films of abortion, where we're studying the patient, I suppose we could use that word in a clinical film, from a high sort, almost from the eye of God position, right? We're observing them on a table going through this procedure as an object, almost as though they're being seen as a corpse in a CSI episode or something like that. So the high angle creates that position, but there's nothing clinical at all about this particular scene. There's something going on that's clinical. The midwife slash abortionist has her methods, and she's clearly very professional about the way that she does it. But this is not a scene that is sterile in any way. And then finally, the children. What are we supposed to make of this exactly? Is this an expression of perhaps Sophie's regret, or the choice that she didn't make, or the choice that she may make in the future, et cetera, et cetera? The filmmaker doesn't make any of these things explicit. In fact, complicates them, I would suggest. Further complication comes in the scene following the next one. The very next scene, the two lovers go to bed. Sophie is sort of sleeping in recovery, and a couple of hours later they go and wake her up, and at Eloise's suggestion again, they recreate the scene of her abortion. And I'm drawing three images from this rather than having you watch the entire recreation. We have the image of the artist, Marianne, who's sort of bearing witness. We have Eloise, who's standing in for the abortionist, and we have Sophia as herself. And essentially why Eloise wanted this to happen is because she wanted Marianne to paint the scene, right? It's exactly the reason she asked her to look in the previous sequence, by the way, so that she could pull in all of that information and remember it. So we see Marianne at the top right, we see Eloise and Sophie in the bottom left, and in the bottom left, we see Marianne's hand as she's sort of sketching out or creating the kind of cartoon, the beginning part of the process of painting this particular picture. I'm going to go back to the director here, Céline Sciamma, who had something to say about this particular scene, which drew a lot of attention. And this is what she had to say. She said, "There's no museum in the world where there is a frame, which is to say a painting or an image, called the abortion. It's an everyday thing, but it's never represented. Why?" Which is, of course, you know, a valid question. We have images of birth, we have images of death, we have images of violence, we have images of joy, we have images of human beings in all forms of duress, all kinds of medical procedures. There's a whole catalog of images of autopsies and dissections in early and middle Renaissance, or pardon me, middle and late Renaissance painting. We have all kinds of images of human beings in in extreme conditions, yet we don't represent abortion in painting, at least in classical painting. We don't really represent abortion in any but the ways that I described previously in contemporary art and film and television, et cetera, et cetera. Why is that exactly? Why is it a taboo subject? Partly in answer to this question, Sciamma says something else in the same interview. She's speaking of the three women in this scene, and she says, "They aren't silent, naked, inspiring women just because they're beautiful in the room." In other words, they aren't objects in this particular scene any more than they're objects in the abortion scene. They're very active. They are the ones in the process of creating something. What we're seeing here is essentially a parallel to what's happening in the film. We have a queer woman making a film about queer women and about sorority, the connection between women, friendships, bonds between women. And she's representing it in a particular way, in a way that hadn't been done before, which, if we sort of extend that argument further, is really only possible in the form that we see it because she is a queer woman, as opposed to the masculine view, which is the gaze of power, the gaze of objectification, and the gaze of desire. So what sort of conclusions can we draw from this? If you look at the statistics in terms of female filmmakers, queer filmmakers, filmmakers of color, which we should include as a kind of intersectional category here as well, because it's something else that we could as easily be discussing in this particular form. The number of folks who are working in directing roles in American film in particular is staggeringly low. The problem with that isn't simply one of workforce. It isn't simply that there's an imbalance in terms of workforce. There's an imbalance in terms of representation and the types of stories that we see. And even more importantly, maybe than the types of stories that we see, the way in which we see them, right? When we see something through a queer eye, when we see something through a gendered eye, when we see something through the eye of a person in a position that's been historically underrepresented for one reason or another, we're seeing things differently, sometimes fundamentally differently. And I want to close with one more quote from the director. She says, "The narrative of the film is based upon the equality of the love story and of sorority because there is no gender domination. Women with women, there is no room for domination there. Embodying equality in relationships should be a wake-up call to creators. That's why it's so important to tell these stories. It's to represent us, so a lot of people feel seen. The film is about mutual gazing, looking and seeing back and forth, not one looking at another in an act of possession. But it concerns much more than our stories. Essentially, what it concerns here, or at least the conclusion I'm drawing from that, is that if we don't see things from multiple perspectives, we aren't actually seeing the full picture. We're not only erasing parts of history, we're keeping ourselves from important stories."